Welcome to 3 Minutes of History. I'm your future history teacher, Chris Oxenford, and let's get started.
March 4th, 1801, Washington, D.C. Thomas Jefferson advances into the unfinished capital of the United States. The old Senate chamber is packed with onlookers as Jefferson advances to meet Chief Justice John Marshall, his cousin. Notably absent was the outgoing president, John Adams, who had left Washington in the middle of the night to avoid being present at this very ceremony. Jefferson raised his right hand, placed his other hand on a Bible, and was sworn in as the third president of the United States. 4 years earlier, during the election of 1796, Jefferson had been elected vice president, narrowly losing to John Adams. In the 4 years between 1796 and 1800, Adams had made himself unpopular. He was not, in terms of personality, a particularly effective politician. He was, in fact, considered obnoxious and was disliked by many of his colleagues. When he was courting his wife Abigail, John Adams wrote her a letter listing her faults. Miraculously, she was more amused by this than anything. During his presidency, Adams had made several unpopular decisions. He had led the United States into an undeclared war with France, the quasi-war, that had seen the two sides raiding and burning each other's shipping in the Caribbean for the 2 years between 1798 and 1800. He had also pushed through the passage of the Alien and Sedition Act. The 4 laws that made up the Alien and Sedition Act made it harder for immigrants to become citizens of the United States, allowed the president to deport hostile aliens, and made it a crime to publish false or slanderous statements that were critical of the government. These acts made Adams even more deeply unpopular with the American people. Despite these weaknesses, Adams was renominated by the Federalist Party for a second term. While there were no primaries or caucuses in 1800, his renomination was not entirely unopposed. There was a faction of Federalists, the so-called High Federalists, that were opposed to Adams. They were led by former Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. After George Washington had left office in 1796, Hamilton had seen his influence in the government decline. Adams did not listen to him and did not respect his advice. In fact, when Adams believed that 2 of his cabinet members were taking instructions from Hamilton, he fired them. The rift between the 2 men led Hamilton to write, in October 1800, a 54-page letter in which he denounced Adams as vain, emotionally unstable, impulsive, and unfit to be president. This letter was published by the Democratic Republicans and damaged both Adams and Hamilton. In contrast to the Federalist disunity and infighting, the Democratic Republicans were strongly united behind Thomas Jefferson. As the author of the Declaration of Independence and in the intellectual leader of the party, Vice President Jefferson was nominated by the Democrats' Congressional Caucus. To balance the tickets, the party chose Aaron Burr, who was popular in New York and helped to get that state to support the Democratic Republicans. The election campaign between Adams and Jefferson was characterized by a great deal of mudslinging and political attacks. Jefferson's supporters denounced Adams as a hideous, hermaphroditical character who has neither the force or firmness of a man, nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. In reply, Adams' campaign called Jefferson a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian, sired by a Virginian mulatto father. In the end, Adams's unpopularity would lead to his defeat. Jefferson and Burr both received 73 electoral votes, beating out Adams and his running mate. But the election wasn't over. In the event of a tie in the Electoral College, the Constitution requires that each state's congressional delegation cast a single ballot for president, and that whoever gets a majority of these votes wins. For 36 ballots, neither Burr nor Jefferson could get a majority of the House votes. It fell to Alexander Hamilton to once again intervene. Hamilton wrote letters and convinced several of his fellow Federalists to cast blank votes and allow Jefferson to get the majority of the House votes. Hamilton chose to endorse Jefferson, his political opponent, because he believed that Burr was unprincipled and unfit for the presidency. Hamilton's endorsement of Jefferson over him was one of the many causes that would lead Burr to challenge and kill Hamilton in a duel 4 years later. Jefferson would be sworn in as the nation's third president on March 4, 1801. This inauguration marked the first transition of power between presidents of two different political parties. Jefferson would serve 8 years as president before retiring to Monticello.
This has been 3 Minutes of History. I'm Chris Oxenford. Thank you for joining me.